Moon Knight Episode 1 has released, and I gotta say, I enjoyed it. First off, I really like the character of Steven. He is a very likable character that you can tell is unhappy and lonely, but he always tries to put on a positive outlook on things, and you just can't help but like the guy.
Honey, I'm home. Oh, I forgot I'm not married.
He is a genuinely nice character, and judging by the first episode, I gotta say, Steven is the best new MCU character I've seen for a very long time. And Oscar Isaac does a great job portraying him too, and he even does a great job with the accent. Ethan Hawke is the villain, and we don't see much of him, but as of right now, he's kind of boring and generic to me. So I hope they work on him in the upcoming episodes. I gotta say, this is probably the best pilot to an MCU show, and it's really nice to see an MCU property that does not constantly try to connect itself and make references to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's telling its own story, and I really like that. It is the first MCU property that stands on its own, so far at least. And the action scenes were cool. Nothing great, but they had a bit of uniqueness here and there, which I liked. And I like how you are just as confused about what's going on as Steven is. And you can see that one of his personalities knows how to brutally fight. And I really hope that we get to see his brutal fighting style on screen in the upcoming episodes. Also, when it's night or dark, the show looks really good and does look different from the rest of the MCU movies and shows. When in daylight, however, the cinematography and colors look flat like a generic looking MCU film. I also thought that there was something very off with this episode's build-up. Now the setup with Steven and his character development is fine, and the humor is actually pretty good most of the time, but there were several scenes in this episode that didn't have the proper build-up. This awkward reaction, for example, felt like it escalated very quickly. I feel like he needed to have done something really strange for this woman to act the way she did, but he didn't, and it made the joke feel like an overreaction to me. But the main problem I have with the build-up is the horror throughout this episode. Horror needs slow and quiet moments to build up tension, and then the scare comes into play. But the horror in this episode just happens, and there's no build-up at all. And you can tell that Marvel are trying to incorporate horror, but it's clear that they don't know how to do it. I mean, the Batman had horror, and it was much more effective, such as the opening serial killer scene with the Riddler. It had the perfect amount of build-up, and the way the TV's light was reflecting off of the Riddler's glasses, and you were constantly on the edge of your seat waiting for him to strike, that's what the proper amount of build-up does to a horror scene. It makes you dread the payoff. But none of the horror in the first episode of Moon Knight felt anywhere near as skillfully crafted as the horror in the Batman. And this show is dealing with supernatural horror, so it should be scarier. But the horror stuff just happens very quickly, and this thing is not particularly frightening. And before you see it in the horror scenes, you hear its voice. And the voice sounds very kiddie or very goofy. It honestly reminded me of a more goofier version of Tom Hardy's Venom voice.
Go back to sleep, worm. You're not supposed to be here. The idiot's in control. No, the idiot's back.
So when you hear that goofy voice and then see this thing haunting Steven, it takes what's left of its scare factor away. They needed to give it a more haunting and demonic voice, but the voice it has sounds more like Aslan from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and that's not frightening. And the horror music was good, but I feel like they hilariously overused it in this one scene where a more subtle music would have worked better. Also, the CGI in this show is terrible. Again, Marvel are not even crashing real cars anymore like they used to, and the werewolf looks so fake it's unbelievable. And there is some obvious green screen going on here too. I mean, this has a big Disney budget, and meanwhile, Netflix has much more real looking monsters in The Witcher. Also, we don't see any violence in this episode of Moon Knight. We see the aftermaths, which shows us some blood on Steven's hands after he blacks out, but we never see any actual violence, so I'm hoping we see more in the upcoming episodes. Also, this scene with the glass felt like the scene in the opening of Doctor Strange when a guard has his head cut off. It happens, but it feels forced just for Marvel to act edgy for one scene. It doesn't feel organically dark though. So I like a lot of the stuff that they are trying to do in this episode, especially with their attempts at incorporating horror, and they definitely get my respect for that, but this feels like horror from an inexperienced horror director, and having just recently seen the horror in the Batman, and some surprisingly pretty decent horror scenes in some Morbius clips, I feel like Moon Knight is the least skillfully crafted when it comes to incorporating its horror. And on top of that, it keeps switching between tones so rapidly that the horror vibe doesn't really sit with you. And Moon Knight's reveal in the end felt underwhelming to me. I really think they should should have built him up even more and maybe had Steven get some kind of injury, but instead, Moon Knight showed up too quickly and it just didn't seem as cool as it should have been. I honestly think that Moon Knight's reveal is one of the things I will remember the least about this episode. I gotta admit though, the more times I watch this scene by itself, it keeps getting a little cooler each time. I just wish it gave me that impact on my first viewing. So yeah, I have problems, but I do like that this show feels more different from the other MCU properties. Now don't get me wrong, there are plenty of scenes where it still does feel like an MCU show, they haven't completely separated it, but for now, they have separated it enough that I am liking what I see. I really do like this episode and I am genuinely interested to see where the show goes next, and I actually came out quite happy when I finished watching this episode, so I'm delightfully surprised and I'm eager to see more, and this episode gets a good 7 out of 10. Also, it's worth pointing out that we only see Moon Knight at the very end, so I can't comment on him as a superhero yet. But regardless, I know Moon Knight has multiple different personalities, but I really hope that they make Steven the heart of the show, and I hope he gets some good development as the season goes on too, and I really hope they don't turn him into an MCU comic relief. Alright, episode 2 of Moon Knight. The episode opens with Steven waking up in his bed, only this time he is much more aware of what he gets up to at night. And I like watching Steven trying to talk to his different personality, although it is very weird that these Egyptian dogs are around but can't be seen by people. And it started out interesting at first, but then when that thing is invisible for like 90% of the fight scene, it occurred to me that they made it invisible as a means to make budget cuts, because they clearly don't want to put much money into these effects as these monsters look so unbelievably fake. And how light do these things attack anyway? She's getting knocked around a bunch and she keeps getting back up like it's nothing. The rest of the episode I really enjoyed. I like the interaction between Steven and Ethan Hawke's character, as well as the information he drops about the Egyptian Grim Reaper here. We find out that Ethan Hawke's character used to have the Moon Knight abilities and that he wants the Scarab to awaken some powerful Egyptian force and yada yada yada. We also find out that the personality of Mark has a wife that was hinted at in the previous episode, and her character is okay so far. I need to see more of her to provide a full opinion. There was also a horror-ish scene that wasn't scary but was well made, and I was really enjoying it, and then this weird stuff happens. What the hell was that, and why did they do that cheap freeze frame? This is what the MCU always do. They create a very well put together scene and then they think, damn, this is getting too serious. We can't have that. Throw a joke in there to lighten the tone. So they did this freeze frame of him screaming. Talk about spineless, Marvel. You really can't keep a serious scene for long, can't you? And things only get goofier. Now, Mr. Knight is a character that I thought looked so badass and intense going by the posters. I mean, you look into his eyes and see someone who is really disturbed in there. And I was so curious to see what this character would be like, and if he would possibly have a different personality altogether. And it turns out that he doesn't have a different personality, and despite having this super intense look, and despite having this super serious fight scene, this is what his introduction is like. And keep in mind, the intense fight isn't even over yet.
Oi, Steven, what the hell are we wearing? Don't know. She said I needed a suit. Yeah, the ceremonial armor from Conchu's temple, not Psycho Colonel Sanders. Well, I don't know how any of this shit works, man.
What the hell is going on here? How do we go from that super serious fight scene that's still going to this prolonged, overly goofy conversation? And the Egyptian attack dog that can easily attack him very politely waits for him and lets him have his overly goofy comedic MCU scene. I said in my review of episode 1 that I don't want Steven to become an MCU comic relief, and unfortunately that's exactly what he becomes in this scene. In episode 2 in fact. That is so freaking early. And if that's the case, I actually want Steven to just stay depressed, because if he becomes happy, then it's clear that Marvel are just going to turn him into another comic relief. I mean, the way he pulls his fists up and the goofy music, it felt like something out of the Looney Tunes. And the rhyming he did, why?
Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. My name's Steven with a V.
I cringed at the jokes in this scene. They were so bad, and they went from something that was very serious to something incredibly goofy, and it was a horrendous portrayal of tone.
Wagwan! I did it! You got planted! Layla!
And then it gets 100% serious again and gives us Moon Knight. And this is the first time we see some proper Moon Knight action, and it was a chase scene. And it was pretty cool, but it was over as soon as it started. And most of the time, Moon Knight's movements and the way he would walk and run looked like CGI. They also attempted some really cool looking cinematography as well, but the chase scene was so short that it didn't leave an impression. That is my biggest problem with it. Well, that and the unnecessary CGI on Moon Knight. But yeah, we get a few more scenes and then the episode is over. So, this show went full on MCU for those 2 scenes, and it's a real shame, because I liked the rest of this episode, but those 2 comedic scenes felt so out of place with this more serious tone that it really did leave a very bad taste in my mouth. And what makes this sad is that this episode actually has my favorite scene of the 2 episodes so far, and that is the scene where Mark and Steven talk to each other. But yeah, this episode would have also gotten a 7 out of 10 from me, but those 2 comedic scenes, they really did feel like they came from a completely different TV show, and they really did take me out of the episode and ruin the fun I was having. So this episode gets a 5 out of 10. Now we move on to episode 3, and oh boy, this show had such promise with the first episode, and it has been a downward spiral ever since. It honestly feels like just a bunch of random stuff happened in this episode, most of which is not interesting and could have been done so much better. First off, this is one of the most embarrassing excuses of a court case I've seen in my life. The writing was so poor, and these god characters are so dumb. First Eternals, and now this. I don't like the way that Marvel are handling their god characters one bit. And the build up to Moon Knight started out good, and the tension was building and it was getting more intense, but then the tension just stopped. And I thought, oh okay, well I guess they don't need Moon Knight anymore.
Hey, he's gone. Where is he?
Yep, right when the tension drops, he suddenly shows up on the roof just so he can jump back down. So yeah, the build up to Moon Knight in this episode was very poorly handled, and I gotta say, I really don't think that Marvel know how to make the most of Moon Knight. I mean, if Matt Reeves directed the character, then he would very cleverly build him up and utilize him very well, but the showrunner and the directors clearly don't know how to make the most of him, even though he has tons of potential. Also, what exactly are Moon Knight's abilities? Is the suit invincible, or is he? He survives all of these stabs, which goes right through the suit, so what? Does he really need the suit, or is the suit just meant to look cool and give him his throwing stars and help him glide? I really think they needed to make his powers more clear, because not knowing made his powers a little less fun to watch and a bit confusing. As for the stuff I like how Mark Spector is now the one blacking out and waking up in different locations, and it's hinted that there might be a third personality within them. It was also cool watching Steven and Mark team up and combine their skills, even though Steven was a real fool when he tried to make peace with these murderers. That is too stupid even for him. And like the previous episodes, I still really like the cinematography during the dark scenes. They are by far the best looking scenes that I have seen in the MCU for as long as I can remember. And I also like the joke when he punches this guy who does this cliched crazy knife lick thing. But the action with Mark throughout this episode presented a big problem. The way Mark fights in this episode is nothing like the way he fought off screen in that first episode. There is not a single drop of blood when he's fighting as himself or even as Moon Knight, and I knew that Marvel wouldn't have the guts to actually show that kind of violence on screen. So much for the show being darker. Also, Ethan Hawke's character just started to make me ask more questions. Why does he cripple himself by putting glass in his shoes? There's no upside to this, and I would like to know why he did it, because like I said, it feels like the MCU just got him to do it so they could act dark and edgy, but there is no reason or merits for it, other than to say, look at how dark we're getting. What power did he show this guy? How does he have the ability to kill people just by touching them? Even the Egyptian Grim Reaper here started to look really silly with the way they put him in shots. And again, I cannot stress this enough. Mark fighting did not match what we saw in the first episode. So on its own, I'm sure the choreography is decent, but it does not match the brutality we saw of Mark's body count in episode 1. And I knew Disney Marvel would not show that, and well, here we are. I mean seriously, his fighting style doesn't match the brutality of the dead bodies left behind. Honestly, this episode just made me feel sad, because this is a show that I should really like, and at the beginning, I did. But now I feel disinterested, and the one thing that I was really interested in, that being Moon Knight, is very tame and not as intimidating a presence as he should be. I really do feel like the MCU is holding him back, because they can say that he did all of this intense violence off screen, but on screen, they don't show it. They don't go through with it. The blood on his hands is window dressing to make you think that the MCU are being darker, but when it comes to showing how he got it on his hands, the MCU retreat back to their safe space like they usually do. So yeah, this episode was undoubtedly the worst of the three to me, and it gets a 4 out of 10. It's that forgettable and disappointing to me. We only have 3 episodes left, so let's hope they can get better and do the character of Moon Knight justice. So Steven and Layla are on the run, and Steven is knocked out and doesn't have his powers, so she drags him down the sand and then tries to hide. And how dumb are these bad guys? They saw someone running towards the truck, and they say this. Why do they check around the truck and not check in the truck? How dumb can these guys be? If they saw someone running towards the truck, then surely they try to hide inside the truck. I also found this joke to just be awkward and again, kinda silly.
Oh, wow, look at you.
Oh, yeah, they're gorgeous, aren't they?
This joke, on the other hand, made me laugh. It was predictable and childish, but still, I love when this joke is executed properly. Even Fantastic Four did this joke very well. I gotta say though, the romance between Layla and Steven was incredibly awkward in this. And this joke just raised more questions, such as how much control does the trapped personality actually have on the body? He brings up the kiss later, so this joke was kind of funny, but when you think about it, it does feel like Marvel wanted to just put this joke in at the expense of their personality switching logic. Also, me and my brother talked about this flare and how much red flares are being used in comic book properties lately. Aquaman used it in a way which was very artistic and colourful, and then you have the Batman, which made the red flare iconic, and Moon Knight uses it in a way which is just, here is a flare. I mean, no pun intended, but there is no artistic flair to the flare. Aside from those observations and flaws, however, this was a damn good episode. It felt like we were actually doing something this time round, and there was also some horror in this episode where a creature from the Lord of the Rings takes a person's guts out. It was definitely pulled back, as more screaming should have been involved, but this was a very effective scene. More like this, please, Marvel. And I actually found myself really invested in what was going on, and I like this creature, which in all honesty looks 100% like an orc from the Lord of the Rings. My only real complaint with this scene is that the music did not add to the scary moment. It needed to be more horror-like, but instead it was more generic and didn't really do anything to make the scene any scarier or more intense. This show in general seems to have a problem with using its music effectively. There are scenes where it works well, but then there are times like this where the music does not react to the events that happen, making Ethan Hawke's surprise entrances always feel so incredibly dull. But aside from that, it was really good, and the episode ended in a way which was very surprising. It turns out that Mark was in a mental hospital this whole time, and everything he saw was inspired from the things that were around him. And this episode would have been fantastic if it just ended here, as the tension kept increasing with panic, and the scene also had the best use of music. But rather than end, the episode kept going, and it started to give us too many answers. They told us too much. We know that both Mark and Steven are not hallucinating because both of their memories are in sync, and this is clearly their third personality. And my guess right now is that Ethan Hawke wants something from Mark and Steven and is using them so he can convince them that he is a therapist, and so he can get wherever information he wants from them whilst they're in this shot state. I could be wrong, but that's my guess right now. My fear is that it's just going to become a typical Marvel storyline in the end, so I'm not going to hold my breath that Marvel are going to smartly commit to this storyline and do something different in the end. It's just not their style. Their universe is the MCU, and they need to get Moon Knight in there somehow, so as artsy and ballsy as this is, I know they are not going to commit to it because, well, it's a Disney Marvel property. Also, Mark and Steven meeting each other as two separate people should have been a much bigger deal than it was. And the episode ended in a way that I would normally hate, but it was actually really funny. I like how Mark screams like a man and Steven screams like a wimp. It was funny in both a serious and humorous way to end the episode. I just don't know what I think of the hippo that honestly seems too stupid to me, as is the voice. But we'll see how it goes. But yeah, this is my favorite episode of Moon Knight so far. It's even better than the first episode, and it gets a high 7 out of 10. It's funny, the best episode of this show so far doesn't even have Moon Knight in it. So, because I waited an extra week before watching this episode, I can move straight on to episode 5. Holy crap! How did Moon Knight suddenly get so good? This episode reminded me a lot of WandaVision, how it had that one episode that went into the mind of Scarlet Witch and gave us a look at some of her backstory. And that's what this episode is. And much like WandaVision, this origin episode is my favorite episode of the show so far. The drama and emotion that both Steven and Mark go through, which ties directly into their relationship together, and how Steven was born, was so interesting to watch. And Steven being the made-up personality the whole time was such a good twist, because it turns out that Steven was the made-up personality and Mark was the original owner of the body all along. So from the very beginning, this show focused on the secondary character rather than the main character, which is a very good fake out. And that's why Mark was married and did all of this stuff when Steven was asleep, because he is the original personality, the true owner of the body. And there is an even sadder story involving Mark and Steven's mum, which was really quite tragic. And the music, and especially the acting from Oscar Isaac as these two characters, is some of the best acting I've seen from the entire MCU. And when Steven came to the harsh realization of what he really is, that was really sad. See, when Steven is depressed, he is a fantastic character. My eyes watered up a little during some of his emotional scenes, as opposed to when he becomes happy and then he is a typical MCU comic relief. And I really did feel sorry for him. Although, Steven was in control of the body and saw his mother beat him, so I don't know how he forgot about that and never remembered it. That was very odd to me. So there are plot holes and inconsistencies here and there, and the story is not perfect in its execution. But the good stuff was really good. And then that damn hippo shows up, and then things felt so corny MCU. I understand what this is supposed to represent, but why did they have to do it in such a goofy way? Especially when this is such a damn emotional episode. This hippo cheapens everything, and it feels like it came out of a Taika Waititi MCU film. And it just really conflicts with the more serious tone that Moon Knight is going for. And I think this just went way too far. Also, I don't think that Steven is actually dead. This is the MCU, no one ever dies, and we have the multiverse now, so that is sadly even more true. So yeah, episode 5. It was damn good, and undoubtedly the best episode of the season, and it gets an 8 out of 10. It's important to note though that episodes 2 and 3 are still bad, and episodes 4 and 5 do not redeem them. If anything, they just make them worse. How dare you turn me off to this show right when it was about to be good? It's also important to note that the goodwill that came with these 2 episodes can easily be undone if the final episode is a disappointment. And let's face it, these MCU shows are not known for ending on a high.
Don't say that. That's not true.
So, let's see if it is a disappointment or not. It's time to review the final episode of Moon Knight. So, we got the final episode of Moon Knight, and from beginning to end, I absolutely hated everything I saw. I don't even know where to start. Right from the beginning of the episode, the events that were happening felt incredibly dull and heartless. It felt like it was trying to wrap things up as quickly and easily as possible, and every turn that this episode took just kept disappointing me again and again and again. Now that the show is over, I can confidently say that I don't like Layla as a character. I said I needed to see more of her, and now I have, and right from the opening when she's crying over Mark's dead body, I just didn't care for her losing him. And then she turns into a superhero, and I thought she looked bloody ridiculous. And the whole concept of diversity is not a bad thing, but then Marvel feels the need to spell it out for everyone. How humble of you, Marvel. And the fight when Steven and Mark were switching back and forth, I thought that was cool, but then just like in episode 3, it keeps cutting to Layla fighting as well. We still have not gotten a single uninterrupted Moon Knight fight scene in this show, and even though it has been given the name, I feel like we did not get enough Moon Knight in a show that is called Moon Knight. And Moon Knight is essentially just Mark in a costume. Going back to Layla, this episode is so rushed that they didn't even give closure to the whole thing with Mark being responsible for her father's death. It's like they just forgot about that. Seriously, this episode is so rushed, it's unbelievable. Also, the hippo was stupid enough, and now we've got a female Lake Placid walking around, and then she fights the Grim Reaper here, and this was just silly to me. If I want to watch a kaiju fight, then I'll just watch Godzilla vs. Kong or Pacific Rim or something. I did not watch Moon Knight to get a kaiju fight. They should have just stuck to Moon Knight. The god characters were also surprised that someone is trying to release the very goddess that Khonshu was telling them the whole time. What idiotic characters, and you see them get killed off screen. And bizarrely, Lizardface here gets all of these souls and gets gets bigger and she is more or less equal in power to Khonshu, which is so odd. You'd think that he would be able to kill her then before she sucks all of those souls when she is much weaker. Also, I have already told you that Layla was a boring as heck character, but so was Ethan Hawke's character. Every time he is on screen as the villain, I was just bored, and I especially didn't care about him from the very beginning of this episode, and he got defeated off screen. Some final encounter. Yeah, this episode disappointed me from beginning to end. How they could go from that 5th episode that was so good to this generic MCU action scene absolutely baffles me. Even as far as MCU action scenes go, this was so underwhelming. Also, I found this image to look so silly. A Grim Reaper wearing a suit with his legs crossed like some kind of gangster. This whole show he is dressed like a mythic god, and now he is dressed like a gangster for some reason. It doesn't feel organic. It just feels like Marvel wanted this to be a gangster scene, so they dressed him up as such. Now, the credit scene itself was very good and gives you some additional information as to who Jake is, and it appears that the third personality, Jake, is a murderer, and that opens the door for Stephen and Mark to have some great character development and struggles down the line. And I also like how it essentially tells you that the brutal beatings right from the very first episode were not Mark like we thought it was. So that's cool, and I like how this episode tells you that. But that's a credit scene. The rest of the actual episode I thought was terrible. It was rushed, we were not given closure or even a proper final battle with Ethan Hawke's character, and all the while they decided to force in another superhero even though this episode is already as short as it is. Also, Stephen comes back like I said he would. No surprise there. The final episode ended up being everything I feared it to be and much worse. Nothing in this episode felt like it was built up and earned. Khonshu gets brought back so easily, Stephen gets back easily, the bad guy gets defeated off screen so easily, the other bad guy gets taken out so easily. Jumanji much, Marvel? Every possible conclusion to each and every storyline in this episode was awful. The credit scene was cool, but that's really there to tease a season 2. They haven't confirmed it yet, but questioning if they will is just dumb. Of course they're gonna make a season 2. Season 1, however, had its ups and downs, and the final episode is so bad I don't know how it could have been worse. This is gonna sound harsh, but this is the score that comes to my head. The final episode of Moon Knight gets a 2 out of 10. There was only 2 things I liked about it. A bit of the interchanging action between Stephen and Mark, and the credit scene. Aside from that, this episode is absolutely terrible, and the show as a whole gets a low 6 out of 10. This show had the potential to be so great, and episode 5 really was great, but episode 6 is the worst episode of the entire season, and it continues the trend that the final episode to the MCU shows are incredibly weak, and I think this is the worst final episode of all of them, which is ironic because I thought Moon Knight had the best first episode out of all of them. Take the MCU-isms out of this show, and that's when it's at its best. I had the same criticism for Multiverse of Madness as well. The only ones getting in Marvel's way at this point from being truly new and great is Marvel. Get out of your own way and watch the MCU become something truly special, rather than just studio-mandated universe cliffhangers at this point. This is one of the worst conclusions I've seen to an MCU show, and when you take into account the lineup that we've had, that's saying something. My favorite MCU show by far is still Hawkeye. It knew what it was, and in my opinion, it mostly took full advantage of it. And I actually felt like watching it again recently, which speaks volumes of how much I enjoyed it. But yeah, Moon Knight, such a disappointment. This is Marvel's Batman, huh? I am really dreading what the MCU do with Daredevil Season 4, especially when you take into account that they didn't even hire the fantastic writer that gave us Season 3 and had big plans for Season 4. Instead, they hired Matt Corman and Chris Ord, both of whose most notable writing credit is Deck the Halls, a horrifyingly bad and unfunny comedy. And these are the 2 writers that Kevin Feige hires to write for arguably the best Marvel superhero show. A couple of bad comedy writers. Yeah, can't wait. Clearly I'm just being an MCU hater. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Moon Knight. It had such potential to be a departure from the regular MCU content that we get, and with episode 5 it got so close. But then with episode 6, Marvel just completely backtracked, and that's why I have zero faith in them when it comes to doing more sophisticated dramas with their movies or TV shows. So thanks for watching my binge watch for Moon Knight. Stay tuned as I got plenty of other Versus videos and binge watch videos on the way as well, including a binge watch of the new Obi-Wan show once it has been completely released, and of course, very soon I'll release the Spider-Man 3 Versus video. Thank you very much as always for watching, guys. I really do appreciate it. Please give the video a thumbs up as it really does help, and place your comments below, and I will catch all of you very soon. Take care.